June 6, 1944. A pilot climbs into his fighter plane over the English Channel, his gun camera loaded and synchronized with his machine guns. He doesn't know it yet, but if he shoots down an enemy aircraft today and survives to tell about it, his word alone won't be enough. The military has a problem with pilot reports. They need proof. So they've installed automatic cameras in every fighter, cameras that roll only when the trigger is pulled. What those cameras captured would become some of the most brutal evidence of aerial combat ever recorded. Look closely at the footage and you'll see something the pilots couldn't unsee. Enemy aircraft still carrying their external fuel tanks underneath the wings, drop tanks designed to extend range. But there's a reason seasoned pilots jettisoned them before combat. When tracer rounds punctured those tanks, the planes didn't just go down, they exploded. Instantly. One frame the aircraft is there, the next it's a fireball. And in some sequences, if you watch carefully, you can see the pilot ejecting, a parachute opening, a man who might make it home. But most of the time when you see an explosion like that, you know the pilot never got back. The cameras recorded it all. The proof required for a confirmed kill was also proof of how a man died. These gun camera reels weren't kept as trophies, they were evidence in a larger calculation, a grim mathematics that high command needed to understand. How effective were our fighters? How quickly could we establish air superiority? Because without control of the skies, everything else would fail. The landings, the supply lines, the entire invasion. And that calculation began not over Normandy, but over England itself, in the strange, suspended days before D-Day, when thousands of men waited, knowing the invasion was coming, but not knowing when. London in the spring of 1944 was a city holding its breath. Barrage balloons floated above the rooftops, tethered steel elephants designed to snag low-flying enemy aircraft. There were so many balloons, so much equipment pouring into the British Isles that soldiers joked the only thing keeping the island from sinking under the weight was the balloons themselves holding it all up. The humor was dark, but it was necessary. Soldiers and correspondents wandered the city, visiting Westminster Abbey, watching speakers at Marble Arch debate everything from politics to theology, while police stood by, intervening only when arguments turned physical. The city was being bombed nearly every night, yet on Sunday afternoons, life continued with a strange, defiant normalcy. Children drank from community cups changed to public fountains, young boys in short pants, unaware or unconcerned that their city was a target. Many children had been evacuated, sent to the countryside, but thousands remained. They found entertainment where they could, playing in the rubble, adapting to a world where air raid sirens were as common as church bells. Food was scarce. Convoys brought in whatever supplies could be spared, unloaded at the docks under bright skies that were rare for London. Soldiers waiting for the invasion filled their days with the mundane. They visited Buckingham Palace, watched the changing of the guard, now performed not in ceremonial bearskin hots, but in full combat uniform. The war had stripped away the pageantry, leaving only function. Then came the order. Correspondents were issued shovels as their primary defensive weapon, not rifles, not sidearms, shovels. The instrument proved valuable, though not in the way you'd expect. Among those correspondents was Ernie Pyle, already legendary for his dispatches from North Africa and Italy. There was Larry LeSueur from CBS, Jack Thompson of the Chicago Tribune, and others, all gathering on England's south coast, saying their farewells, expecting to meet again in Paris. Some would make it, others wouldn't. They rode 150 miles in the back of military trucks through small British towns where civilians bought food in marketplaces as though nothing unusual was happening. When the trucks finally stopped, the correspondents were sore, exhausted, and staring at Plymouth. The city was destroyed. Entire blocks reduced to rubble from German bombing raids. This wasn't propaganda, this was the reality of a city that had absorbed years of aerial assault. And now, at the docks, American jeeps lined up, waiting to be loaded onto landing craft. Each jeep had a modification you wouldn't find in any manual.
metal bars welded to the front bumpers, angled upward like tusks. They were designed to cut through wires. The Germans had developed a tactic of stretching wire across French roads at neck height, designed to decapitate drivers in open vehicles. The bars would hit the wire first, snapping it before it could kill. This was the level of detail the invasion required, anticipating even the methods of murder the enemy might employ.
At every crossroad leading to the embarkation points, two soldiers stood guard, one American, one British. They checked identification, inspected belongings, enforced the secrecy that was now vital. The invasion date was known only to those who needed to know, and if you tried to wander off alone, you'd find yourself stopped, questioned, searched. The precautions were extreme, but they had to be. If the Germans learned the landing sites in advance, the invasion would become a slaughter. The correspondents boarded LCI No. 5, a landing craft infantry vessel commanded by Lieutenant Patton, not George Patton, just a lieutenant who shared the famous name. He'd participated in invasions across the Mediterranean, which gave the men some comfort. They'd be with someone who knew what he was doing. What they didn't know was how long they'd be waiting. 5 days. 5 days aboard that landing craft, living in close quarters with soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division, men carrying everything they could by hand: grenades, bazookas, ammunition, rations. The landing craft were so heavily loaded they had to be pushed off the docks by trucks. They couldn't move under their own power until they hit the water. One soldier from the 101st entertained the others with an impression. He was a former Notre Dame football player, and his imitation was so good that everyone knew exactly who he was mimicking. The men laughed. They needed that moment. Later, after the invasion, the correspondents learned that soldier had been killed in action. The memory of his impression, the sound of men laughing on a crowded landing craft, became something else. Evidence of a man who'd been alive, funny, hopeful, and then wasn't. Even the ship's mascot had a life preserver. The crew fashioned one just like their own, ensuring that if the ship went down, the dog had a chance. It was absurd and touching in equal measure, the kind of detail that reveals how men cope when they know what's coming. On the afternoon of June 5th, Lieutenant Patton gathered the crew and told them they'd be sailing that evening. The men cheered. After 5 days of waiting, they wanted to get it done and go home. The LCI No. 4, with the squadron commander aboard, moved out into the channel first. Then No. 5 followed. And what unfolded before them was a sight none of them had imagined even after months of preparation. Ships from one horizon to the other, over 1,000 vessels, destroyers, transports, minesweepers, landing craft of every type. It looked like an exercise. Surely this was just another drill. They'd turn around, go back, try again another day. But as the fleet continued into the night, the men realized this was the real deal. At one point, a submarine scare sent a destroyer escort dropping depth charges into the channel. The water erupted, but no attack came. German U-boats were out there, but the Allied air and naval screen was holding. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. The skies belonged to the Allies. As dawn broke on June 6th, the fleet made a hard right turn toward the beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The correspondents aboard LCI No. 5 were headed for Utah Beach, and now the question wasn't whether the invasion would happen, but what would be waiting for them when the ramps dropped. The first men ashore weren't filmed by correspondents with handheld cameras. They were filmed by automatic cameras mounted in British landing craft. The cameras were installed for a specific reason. If the landing failed, if the entire invasion collapsed into disaster, the automatic cameras might survive even if the men didn't. The film could be recovered, analyzed, so the next attempt wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. The men waiting ashore in those early frames knew they were being recorded as potential casualties in a disaster scenario. That's what it meant to be first. But Utah Beach wasn't Omaha. The resistance was lighter than expected, though that's a relative term. Men still died, mines still detonated, enemy fire still raked the sand. But after 5 days aboard a cramped landing craft, the soldiers didn't sprint ashore. They walked, slowly,
Cautiously, their rifles wrapped in cellophane to keep sand and seawater out of the mechanisms. They scanned the ground for mines, watched for snipers, moved like men who understood that survival required patience. The correspondents came ashore carrying their own equipment. Pete Carroll, a photographer from Boston working for the Associated Press, Wes Haynes, another correspondent, and the man filming them, documenting his own landing even as he experienced it. The beach was under sporadic fire. In one sequence, you can see a German shell land close enough to send up a geyser of sand and smoke. The bulldozers were already at work, clearing paths for jeeps and tanks, pushing aside obstacles, filling in craters. Even in June, Normandy was cold. The men dug foxholes deeper, sought shelter behind a concrete wall that offered some protection. The wounded were already being carried back to the beach for evacuation to England, and the ships that had grounded on the sand at high tide were now stuck, waiting for the water to return so they could refloat, if they hadn't been hit by then. The correspondents spent the first night in a foxhole. By the second day, German prisoners began arriving. Young men, some looking relieved, others defiant. They were sent back to England immediately because there was no capacity to hold them in Normandy. The beachhead was still fragile, still expanding, and at the first command post, General J. Lawton Collins was already coordinating with his officers. The correspondents got their first hot meal there, and only when they saw the food did they realize how hungry they'd been. 8 days. That's how long the cameraman stayed on the beachhead before running out of film. 8 days without changing clothes, without a proper bath, living in the mud and noise. When he finally caught a ride back to England, landing near Bournemouth, the white cliffs looked like salvation. But England wasn't safe anymore. The V1 flying bombs had started. Buzz bombs, the soldiers called them. You could hear them coming, a sound like a sputtering motorcycle engine. And when the engine cut out, you had seconds before the bomb fell. The British set up anti-aircraft batteries along the coast, trying to shoot them down before they reached London. Fighter pilots went up to intercept them, sometimes flying alongside and tipping the V1's wing with their own, sending it off course into the sea or countryside. It was dangerous work. If you got too close, the blast could take you down too. And plenty of V1s got through. Wherever they landed, they caused devastation. The second crossing of the channel was different. This time, the cameraman traveled aboard an LST, a landing ship tank, with units of the 3rd Armored Division. The tanks were desperately needed. The Americans were pushing toward Cherbourg, the port city that would allow supplies to flow directly into France instead of across the beaches. The LST was manned by a British crew, and it joined a long convoy of similar ships, all loaded to capacity. When they reached Normandy, the beach had changed. Ships now waited for low tide so they could offload vehicles without driving through deep water. On D-Day, the men had no choice. They'd waded through water over their heads, and those who'd fastened their life preservers too low around their waists had flipped turtle and drowned, unable to right themselves under the weight of their equipment. Cherbourg, when the Americans finally took it, was a ruin. The Germans had destroyed the port facilities themselves, denying the Allies the one thing they needed most. The famous docks where transatlantic liners once berthed were rubble. The inland bridges were blown, the canals blocked. It would take nearly 2 months before a ship could dock at Cherbourg. But the city itself was liberated, and the French civilians returned, offering a warm welcome. The German prisoners, 16,000 to 18,000 of them, marched toward the beaches for transport to England and eventually to POW camps in the United States. Some still believed the propaganda. They told their captors the Americans would be pushed back into the Channel within a week. They were wrong. At every abandoned German headquarters, the Americans found the same thing, a portrait of Hitler. The soldiers used them as dartboards. The humor was grim but necessary. And in Cherbourg, General Collins presided over the first official ceremony held in liberated France. He presented a handmade French tricolor sewn from parachute cloth to the mayor of Cherbourg. The men of the 7th Corps were giving clean uniforms for the occasion. It was a moment of formality in a war that had little room for it. Ernie Pyle was there, photographed talking with a Signal Corps colonel. Other correspondents gathered, faces familiar from the pre-invasion days in England. But the war was moving. The troops shifted direction, attacking toward the St. Lo line, passing through Valognes. The city was completely destroyed. The Germans had tried to make a stand, and wherever they made a stand, the Americans had to knock them out. In doing so, entire towns were leveled. Valognes was rebuilt after the war, beautifully, but in 1944, it was a wasteland.
Along the Normandy coast, evidence of German preparation was everywhere. Triangular obstacles, many with mines attached, designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. Slave labor had built them. Forced workers from occupied countries dragged to the coast to construct fortifications they knew might kill men who could have been their liberators. The obstacles stretched for miles, and in some areas, the Germans had built massive concrete bunkers with walls several feet thick. When they withdrew, they destroyed their own fortifications, blowing them up so the Allies couldn't use them. They even destroyed their own artillery pieces, denying the Americans any advantage. At Granville, near the border between Normandy and Brittany, a lighthouse marked the point. The Germans had used it as an observation post, and now the U.S. Navy did the same. American artillery moved into position, big guns set up in fields, firing at German positions miles away. And in those same fields, French farmers brought in their crops. The guns would fire, the concussion shaking the ground, and the farmers kept working, life and death, side by side. The Americans built an airstrip near Sainte-Mère-Église, not far from the coast. The runway was laid over mesh wire to keep planes from sinking into the soft ground. P-47 Thunderbolts took off from there, each carrying 500-pound bombs under the wings. But the strip was rough. Sometimes the bombs broke loose on takeoff, even though they were armed. Ground crews had to disarm them, drag them off the runway, and hope they didn't detonate. Planes took off in pairs, raising huge clouds of dust, managing to get airborne on a strip that seemed too short. And sometimes the mesh wire buckled under the wheels, snapping up and hitting the propeller. When that happened, the plane crashed before it even left the ground. 2 American planes collided during one mission. The gun cameras captured the aftermath. One aircraft breaking apart, the other struggling to stay aloft. Both went down. Accidents pilled men as surely as enemy fire, and in the chaos of massed air operations, they were inevitable. But the gun cameras also captured victories. Enemy fighters shot down, their fuel tanks exploding, pilots ejecting if they were lucky. The footage was reviewed by intelligence officers, confirming kills, studying tactics, learning what worked. And what they learned was that the air war was being won. The Luftwaffe was being ground down, its pilots killed faster than they could be replaced, its fuel supplies dwindling. Every sortie, every confirmed kill pushed the balance further in favor of the Allies. Mont Saint-Michel became a gathering place for correspondents. The island monastery, connected to the mainland by a causeway that flooded at high tide, sat on the border between Normandy and Brittany. Madame Poulard ran a hotel there, famous for her omelets. In the middle of a war, correspondents traveled to Mont Saint-Michel for fresh eggs and a moment of peace. Bob Capa was there, the legendary photographer who would later be killed covering the French war in Indochina. Charles Collingwood, Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News, Joe Liebling of the New Yorker. Ernest Hemingway was there too, covering the war for Collier's magazine, talking with Bill Walton, who would later become a close friend of President Kennedy. One correspondent who gathered at Mont Saint-Michel didn't make it to Paris. Bill Stringer was killed by an 88mm shell while trying to be among the first into the city. The race to Paris was competitive, almost reckless. Correspondents wanted the story, wanted to be first, and some paid for that ambition with their lives. The island itself was beautiful, untouched by the war. The monastery at the top still stood, its walls intact. American GIs toured the interior, guided by a Frenchwoman who'd waited years to show visitors around again. On the beaches nearby, the Germans had planted wooden stakes in the sand, designed to prevent gliders from landing. And on the island, 3 young brothers played under the care of their grandmother. Their parents had been killed at the Battle of St. Lo. The boys didn't know yet how to process that loss. They just played, blonde and smiling, while the war moved on without them. Deeper into France, the countryside opened up. In Brittany, American soldiers found a lake and used it for a proper bath after weeks of washing out of helmets.
The lake was clear, cold, and far enough from the fighting that they could relax. The Germans still held San Malo, a fortified port city, and they'd hold it almost until the end of the war, a stubborn pocket of resistance that the Allies bypassed rather than reduce at great cost. Edward G. Robinson showed up in Normandy. The actor, famous for his gangster roles, came to entertain the troops. A show was held in a barn not far from the front lines. During intermission, shells landed close enough that the performance had to pause, but Robinson kept acting. All you had to do was point a camera at him and he performed. At Honboulot, 52 kilometers from Paris, correspondents gathered in large numbers. Ernie Pyle was there again, along with George Stevens, the Hollywood director. It was shortly after these meetings that Pyle decided to return to the United States, then head to the Pacific. He was killed there, struck by Japanese machine gun fire on Ieshima. George Stevens continued filming, documenting the liberation of Paris and later the discovery of the concentration camps. His footage would become evidence at the Nuremberg trials. General Eisenhower had given permission for the French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc to liberate Paris. The decision was political as much as military. Eisenhower wanted to give the honor to the French, and he didn't want to delay the main Allied thrust by getting bogged down in urban fighting. Leclerc refused to let correspondents accompany his forces into the city. He didn't want any footage made until Paris was secure. The correspondents were frustrated, but they followed anyway, staying close behind the French columns. When Paris was finally liberated, the city erupted. The streets filled with people. Charles de Gaulle, not yet well known to most French citizens, paraded down the Champs-Élysées. Few people had been able to listen to his broadcasts from London during the occupation. But now, seeing him in person, they cheered. He became a symbol of French resistance, even if the reality was more complicated. Then the shooting started. Forces left behind by the Germans, possibly Vichy fascists, possibly nervous resistance fighters, opened fire. The crowd panicked. People threw themselves flat on the pavement, crawled under vehicles, pressed against walls. White flags were raised, trying to signal a ceasefire, but the shooting continued for hours. De Gaulle stood his ground, refusing to take cover. Others weren't as brave. Mothers shielded their children. Men who were just celebrating moments before now lay in the street, praying the gunfire would stop. American troops marched through Paris that same day, heading towards the front lines. They didn't stop to celebrate, but wherever they paused, French civilians appeared with champagne, trading bottles for cigarettes, asking for news, offering thanks. The city itself wasn't badly damaged. The bridges were intact. The Opera House stood. The Eiffel Tower, rumored to have been destroyed, was still there. A correspondent climbed to the top and filmed the city from above, the Seine winding through, troops marching in the streets below. But conditions in Paris were dire. The railroads were destroyed. No food was coming in. Trucks loaded with supplies waited outside the city, but there was no distribution network. Coal was scarce, and winter was coming. The liberation was joyous, but the reality was hard. People were hungry, cold, and uncertain. Beyond Paris, the war continued. In Belgium, the Auteuil racetrack reopened shortly after liberation, which surprised everyone. The authorities shut it down after a few days, but the fact that it had opened at all said something about French resilience. French women appeared well-dressed, using whatever they had to maintain appearances. It annoyed some of the other Allied nations, this insistence on style in the middle of deprivation, but it was also admirable. Art galleries along the streets reopened for business. Painters worked in the old quarters of the city. Life resumed, even as the front lines were miles away. The Ardennes region turned cold, the trees changing color, the weather deteriorating. And in the town of Houfflalise, which would later be completely destroyed during the Battle of the Bulge, there were signs that the Germans were preparing something. The correspondent was in Bastogne just days before the breakthrough, fortunate to leave before the encirclement. The forested terrain was perfect for hiding troops, and the Germans had done just that.
General J. Lawton Collins met with Major General Maurice Rose, commander of the 3rd Armored Division. Rose would be killed in Cologne, shot by German troops who'd been hiding in an area thought to be secure. It was an unfortunate death, one that could have been avoided with better reconnaissance. In Germany, the reception was nothing like France. White flags hung from every house, symbols of surrender, but the people didn't come out to greet the Americans. German children walked to school, holding their ears as American artillery fired nearby. They looked like children everywhere, small and vulnerable, caught in a war they hadn't started. The Siegfried Line, the dragon's teeth, stretched across Germany, massive concrete pyramids built by slave labor designed to stop tanks. But American bulldozers simply pushed dirt over them and drove across. The fortifications were impressive, but ultimately useless. They'd been built on the assumption that Germany could keep the Allies out. That assumption was wrong. In Aachen, the correspondent found himself in a city under fire. Mortar shells passed overhead constantly. The streets were empty. German forces held the center of the city, and American reserves waited just blocks behind the front line, ready to be called in. The fighting was intense, house to house, and casualties were high. A captain photographed in the footage was later killed in the action that followed. After Aachen, the correspondent was invited to fly home. From the air, he filmed the cemeteries above the Normandy beaches, rows of white crosses, thousands of them, marking where men had fallen. And he filmed Berlin, or what was left of it. The city was rubble. The bombing campaign had been relentless, and very little of Berlin remained standing. It was proof, if any were needed, that wars destroy more than they create. Back in the United States, General Eisenhower returned to Kansas City for a homecoming. The correspondent filmed the event from a distance, using a telephoto lens. And he was given access to a collection of captured German weapons. The V-2 rocket, which had followed the V-1 as a terror weapon, was on display. The V-2 was the first ballistic missile, capable of traveling great distances, impossible to intercept. When the V-1's engine cut out, you had seconds. The V-2 gave no warning. It just arrived, supersonic, and detonated. The Germans had jet aircraft in the air before the war ended. One captured jet had a record painted on its fuselage. 42 Russian planes shot down. The technological advantage was real, but it came too late and in too few numbers to matter. A Japanese kamikaze bomb was on display, small and crude, designed for a one-way trip. American pilots examined it, tried the cockpit for size, and rejected the entire concept. The idea of a weapon that required the pilot's death was alien to American tactics. And there was a German aircraft reportedly designed to bomb New York. It had the range to cross the Atlantic and return. The Americans called it Alles Kaputt, everything destroyed. The name was darkly appropriate. The final images were of the atomic bomb test in New Mexico, the mushroom cloud rising, the shockwave spreading, the future arriving. A scientist was quoted, "The atomic bomb is here to stay. The question is, are we?" World War II had been brutal, but the next war, if it came, would be worse. The men who'd fought from D-Day to Germany knew that. They'd seen what conventional weapons could do. They'd walked through the ruins of cities, seen the cemeteries, counted the cost. And now there was a weapon that made everything before it seem small. The footage ended there, not with victory, but with warning. A reminder that the men who'd fought understood the stakes better than anyone. They'd survived, but survival wasn't the same as winning. The real victory would be never having to fight that war again. That was the message carried in the gun camera footage, the home movies, the automatic cameras recording men going ashore. Not glory, but caution. Not triumph, but caution. The war had been won. The peace still had to be.